This session is looking at the role of public financing and how public financing can really help ramp up green hydrogen and facilitate green hydrogen. If any of you were in the previous sessions in the plenary room, you'll hear the strong message that said that without financing, there is no anything without financing, but there's certainly no new industry in green hydrogen. So it's super important. And that, of course, is private financing and public financing. And today we'll focus more on the public financing aspect. A huge thank you to the GH2 organization for asking Irina to, one, be part of the organization. We've been part of the standards committee since the start and supporting it the whole way. And thank you for allowing us to help organize this session. I'm Barbara Jinks. I work for IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Association, looking after their work on green gases, which really is biomethane and hydrogen these days. And I have a wonderful panel of leaders that I'll introduce in a minute. There's no need to say there's a growing awareness of the role of green hydrogen and how important it is. Although it's quite niche, it's absolutely necessary for those harder to decarbonize sectors. And only one part of the solution of reducing emissions and decarbonizing energy. But there's a risk if we don't prioritize green hydrogen in all its aspects that blue and grey and other forms will ramp up faster and slow down our commitments, or our success pathway towards the Paris targets. So IRENA totally supports green hydrogen over other forms for many reasons, one of which is the economics of it, which we'll talk about today. In the IRENA assessments, the World Energy Transition Outlook, it's all on our website, we estimate that hydrogen can form 12% of end use, has to form 12% of end use to provide clean energy to those hard to decarbonize sectors of aviation, shipping, chemical feedstock, and in many cases heating for industry and sometimes in cities. That should reduce carbon emissions by 10%. So it's still a significant part of the solution. And if we think of the financing, how do we incentivize green hydrogen over other forms and just hydrogen in general? And it's a very bad planning would be for governments to subsidize a new industry like hydrogen, but to need that subsidizing for long term. It cannot be long term. So the questions to the panels that we will hear about today is, how do we incentivize green hydrogen? How do we plan long term so that in the fiscal regimes and regulatory frameworks where the government actually gets payback at some point and the industry becomes self-sufficient in terms of financing? And what can we learn from other public finance systems for energy or similar sectors? And what are we doing right now? So that's my overarching comments. Sorry, I just need to boot up my iPad. So on the panel, we have a great panel. I'm going to start here. John Bush is is a director for tax and fiscal reform at the International Lawyers Project. I'll introduce you all and then start chatting, if that's okay. And next we have Minister Tom Alwindo, who's the Minister of Mines and Energy from Namibia. Welcome. And then Ines Bucida from a think tank, IDDRI, and then we have Thomas Koch from the Rocky Mountain Institute. So thank you for all coming. Some of you have come a long way. My first question, I thought I'd ask a lead-in question, and please feel free to take a few minutes to answer it, and then we'll have more of an open discussion. And please, we welcome questions from the audience. This is your chance. This is your chance. Oh, yes, sorry. We also have Sunita from America, from the Department of Energy. We have Sunita Satyapal, who couldn't be with us, so we will have a recording of her message. This is your chance to ask direct questions of the panelists or also give us your comments and statements. So please just raise your hand and I'll bring you in at any point. John, sorry, I will introduce Sunita first, and we'll listen to her recorded message, and then we'll talk in the panel. So Sunita is the Director of Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies in the Department of Energy in the United States.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation, and I apologize I couldn't be there in person, but I'm pleased to be able to give you an overview from the U.S. Department of Energy, where I am the director for the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Office, and also coordinate across the DOE on all the hydrogen programs. So what I'd like to do today is really emphasize first the sense of urgency. If you look at US energy consumption, you can see that we still rely very heavily on fossil fuels. Although renewables are increasing, in fact, last year for the first time, we exceeded consumption compared to coal in terms of renewables. But the high priorities are the administration's goals of net zero by 2050, completely clean grid by 2035. And another priority I'd like to emphasize is what we call energy and environmental justice. So we have a Justice 40 initiative where 40% of the federal benefits would impact disadvantaged communities. So those who've historically experienced energy injustice. So these are high priorities, and hydrogen is one part of a very comprehensive portfolio that covers the entire value chain from production through end use, all the resources, research, all the way through deployment. We actually have about 400 projects that we fund as the funding agency. You can see many companies and labs, but our top priorities are low cost, clean hydrogen, obviously low cost, safe infrastructure, and enabling end use applications at scale, which is depicted in our H2 at scale initiative, showing really the versatility or Swiss Army knife approach of hydrogen. All of our domestic resources, multiple end use applications where hydrogen can serve as a fuel, as a feedstock, energy storage. So it really gives you that optionality and flexibility. And our top priorities, though, are those hard to decarbonize sectors. So industrial, heavy duty transportation, long duration energy storage. And in the US, we have about 10 million metric tons of hydrogen we produce, mostly from natural gas. But we see opportunities for 2, even 5 times more. And if we produced another 10 million metric tons, that would basically double today's solar or wind deployments. These numbers, of course, keep changing, but to produce that amount of hydrogen. It's a huge opportunity here. So some flagship initiatives in the US are Hydrogen Energy Earthshot, launched last year, similar to the moonshots from over half a century ago. These bold, ambitious targets, $1 for 1 kilogram of clean hydrogen in 1 decade. And also the bipartisan infrastructure law, which provides $9.5 billion to the US Department of Energy for clean hydrogen, including electrolysis, clean hydrogen manufacturing and recycling, so focusing on end of life as well, supply chain, and then $8 billion for at least 4 regional clean hydrogen hubs. So very aligned with our goals. Also, we are developing a national clean hydrogen strategy and a roadmap. And so in summary, again, a big thank you to all the organizers for all these activities, lots of resources available from DOE. So please do stay tuned. We have some online major events here in June, our Hydrogen Day in honor of atomic weight of hydrogen. Again, a lot of resources available, Center for Hydrogen Safety. So again, a big thank you. I really look forward to following up with you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
So I'll thank Sunita separately. Sunita's very involved with Irina's work, so it's great to hear from her. So back to you, John. Sorry about that interlude. We know public financing is only one side of the equation, and that the long-term planning is critical for governments to support mechanisms. What are some of the key messages from your recently launched guidance on good contracting for green hydrogen, please?
First of all, let me see. Can everybody hear me? Good. I must admit, I've never heard of the green hydrogen Earthshot. It sounds like Elon Musk must have done that in between his bids for Twitter. But in any event, I digress. Let me say a little bit about the organization that I'm from, the International Lawyers Project. It's probably not something that most of you have heard of. In any event, we're a small UK-based charity that provides pro bono legal services in 3 areas. One, my area, tax and fiscal reform. The second is environmental area, and that's the main reason we're here today. And the third area is anti-corruption. So that's what we do. We work with big law firms to provide pro bono legal services in those 3 areas. So let me turn to the topic here and make a few comments to begin with. I was told to talk a little bit about good governance, and it's sort of an interesting subject in tax. What does that mean? And I'd say it means 2 things to simplify it. One is transparency. Companies should really report how much tax they pay and where they pay it. There's an ongoing debate about that right now, but that's certainly a goal. And the second goal is not to engage in abusive tax transactions. If you engage in a transaction, the success of it should be more likely than not to succeed on audit. So those are 2 goals, very simple goals. Some people may disagree with them, but so be it. I'm going to talk now about tax incentives, and a little bit of my focus will be on developing countries and how that relates to tax incentives. So tax incentives basically are a reduction in the effective tax rate. That can be done just by virtue of an exemption. It can be done by refundable credits of one form or another. In any event, can take a variety of forms to give tax incentives, and you encounter them very frequently in encouraging foreign direct investment into a country. So you see them in investment agreements. There may be some other form of it in the law itself. In any event, tax incentives are a very prominent feature that you find as a way of encouraging investments. I will say that there's a fair debate, at least in academic circles, about the efficacy, the efficiency of these incentives. Do they really encourage the investment they're seeking to encourage? And I think each country is a little bit unique, and in some cases they do, in some cases they may not really do much at the margin to encourage investment. I will say for developing countries that are considering this, and most of them are, proceed with some intelligence and a bit of caution in 2 respects in particular. One is with investment agreements that have what we call stabilization clauses. These are clauses that say that you cannot change our deal at any time in the future. That's against the law, so to speak. So if we give you a tax break for forever, you're taxed at a very low rate, then you can't change that going down the road. The other clause that you find is predominant is ISDS arbitration agreements, and they also can be important. In both cases, however, a little bit of caution is a good idea, because those kinds of agreements can bind you in the future without foreseen consequences. The final part of my comments, I'm going to look at the international tax scene. I assume most of you are not tax lawyers, which is probably fortunate, but in any event.
Anyone a tax lawyer?
Anybody is, well, there we go. And if you aspire to be one, see me afterwards. We're always looking for good volunteers in the area. But be that as it may, the international tax scene is changing in ways that really hadn't happened for 100 years or so. And a lot of that was brought about because of the digital economy. the ability to do transactions, business remotely. You don't have to be physically present in a country anymore. And the second piece really was abusive tax behavior by some large multinationals. Frankly, most of them were in the US. But in any event, they ended up with tax rates on foreign earnings that were close to zero. So those two things coalesced to produce a movement for tax reform, and that's become known as the OECD Inclusive Framework that now includes, I think it's 137 or 141 countries, something of that neighborhood. And the most recent product is something called Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Heaven forbid, very clever names, but be that as it may. The major import of Pillar 2 is a 15% minimum tax rate. So if you're going to give tax incentives as part of your inducement to come into a country, this minimum tax rate could override the incentives you are giving, and it could apply retroactively. And so source countries are, the countries where the production will take place, can give the incentives, but if they don't impose that tax, then the way the law reads is that the tax can be imposed by the resident country of the multinational enterprise. So the US could impose the tax, for example, even though the project is taking place in Namibia. So something to be aware of. If you're looking on tax incentives, then you have to look at the whole landscape, and particularly in connection with the incentives you're giving in terms of low tax rates, this Pillar 2 minimum tax rate. So I'm going to close my opening comments on that basis. I'd love to have questions going forward.
Thanks. Thank you. Tom, Minister Alwinda, Tom, over to you. What public finance mechanisms are you considering for your very ambitious startup with green hydrogen in Namibia? Please.
Thank you, Barbara, and good afternoon to all the audience here. I don't know whether you have realized that there are few issues these days that draw international audience like this other than green hydrogen. Very few these days. Green hydrogen has been able to draw a number of global audience, whether it's policymakers or whether it is developers, financiers. And I guess this is because we do realize the importance of green hydrogen and how to decarbonize, but probably also the fact that we need to put more emphasis on collaboration instead of competition, and therefore everybody feel like, well, we need to learn from each other, and that's quite interesting that how really this is very, very, to see audience from all over the globe to come in and talk about green hydrogen. Now, when we talk about public funding, I was in an earlier discussion about, it was mentioned, public funding. Now, at times people talk about public funding as a tool to de-risk the project. Or at times it's just talked about as, just to participate, public funding to make funds available to actually fund the project. Now, I would want to think that if we are talking about public funding, it should not be because we are de-risking the project. I think the project itself has to there must be a business case for the project. Whether it's the production part of it, or whether it's the technology part of it, or whether it is where is the market for what you are going to produce now, in this case, green hydrogen. So probably if you're really talking about real de-risking, or maybe contracting, those are the things which we need to talk about. How do we, as parties to this project, how do we de-risk that? And clearly government has got a role to play. For example, I can see a situation where a government can use public funds and says, this is a new technology and therefore we want to invest in R&D, for example, to see how it can work. Or we want to put up public funds because we want to actually have a test plant just to see how good it work. So in those area, scenarios, you can actually use public funds just to make it, just to discover how possible it is. But I don't always want to talk as if that's now de-risking the project as such, but really to discover government funds to discover things that we might not have known about. But when it comes to maybe what I would rather want to say, how can governments give some incentives to a green hydrogen project, for example, to start off? I think there's a couple of things governments should do or can do. I talked about making public funds maybe for R&D and developing skills, because in most of our countries, this is a new industry and therefore we will not always have the skills that are necessary and therefore we need to have public funds to do that. But I can also see a situation where, as a government, to give us an incentive to say to a producer, to say, I'm going to have an offtake agreement with you. And therefore, in itself, that will make it possible for then the project to take off. Or if I cannot have my offtake myself, I can arrange for a market somewhere else where this can happen. For example, in our case in Namibia, since we started last year, we have been having engagement with a number of potential off-takers. We've been having discussion with the governments of Germany, we have discussion with Belgium, and all that discussion centered around how can we make sure that this green hydrogen produced in Namibia can be exported to some of those markets. So there are those things which government can do to incentivize a project like that. But I can also see a situation where governments with deep pockets can simply just invest in the project in itself as an investment. But that I also not necessarily want to say is de-risking tool, but simply to say I would want to invest in the project. I can see, for example, in Namibia, we would probably want to have investors who can co-invest with us, either with us as a government, but also private sector Namibians. And we do have those in Namibia where private sector investors are actually teaming up with international investors to do that. But I can foresee a situation where in countries where maybe there aren't actually private sector, local private sector who can co-invest, you may find a government who can potentially then co-invest with a developer. But I think my messaging here just to say, yes, governments can incentivize, can give incentives in various forms to make sure that the project takes off. And not necessarily to de-risk, but the project itself has to make business sense that actually can be developed.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good overview of what it means. It's not a grant, it's investing and incentivizing. And we'll come back to some of those. Ines, you recently wrote in an article stating that hydrogen is key, but a niche vector for decarbonization with its own opportunities and risks relating to public financing. Would you like to comment on that, and also maybe now or later talk about the lessons learned from countries like France that you've been looking at? Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. Yes, I think the first question that you need to ask yourself when designing support policies for hydrogen is, what do we want to use hydrogen for? And a very important idea is that hydrogen has some priority sectors, and that is the industry, that is some segments of transportation, especially maritime and air transport. There are some sectors where hydrogen could play a role, but it's still not sure whether it's a good idea. And there's also a lot of sectors where developing hydrogen is just not a good idea because they're more efficient alternatives and less costly alternatives, low carbon alternatives, obviously. So I think that's the first question that you need to look at when you discuss support policies. And in terms of lessons, I think an important lesson that can be drawn from the EU example and the French example, which I know a bit better, is that support policies to support cheap hydrogen from electrolysis are very important, but it is not the whole answer. There's other policies that can be implemented. And I want to give an example on the French case. The first plan for hydrogen was released in 2018. It was very limited funding, and then a more extensive plan was published in 2020. And you see that until today, or until recently, most of the funding was actually going towards urban buses. And urban buses are not a priority sector for hydrogen. Hydrogen is much more key for the decarbonization of the industry. And actually, it was difficult to get projects put together for the industry because you can't just have a support policy designed for the supply side. You also need schemes to develop end uses. We hope that that's changing in France. It doesn't mean that it's a done deal, you know? And that actually brings me to my second point, which is that policies need to be adaptive. I think it's a lesson that we can draw, especially from the renewables example in the EU from the past decade or two, or even more actually. That when you start a new sector, you have ideas, you start stuff, and then sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes you need to change it after a bit. That's okay. I think we need to leave the door open to adapt policies as we go. Yeah, and if you look at the renewables example, there was this in Europe, and I mean, Spain was also one example that we put a lot of money into renewables, especially solar, and then we were like, okay, that's actually a lot of money. And then it was brutally stopped, and then the sector kind of stalled for a few years, and then it started again when we re-implemented support policies. That's not very efficient. I think it would be good if we don't do that for hydrogen. And we're quite lucky to have this example behind us, the example of renewables. And yeah, if I can talk about one risk also with developing hydrogen, I talked about priority uses in the beginning. The risk if you don't focus on priority uses is that you will overdevelop hydrogen uses. And the way that hydrogen cost works is that it depends on the electricity supply you're using. And as you know, we have cheap electricity, and then we also have less cheap electricity, less cheap, and then until it's expensive. And the more hydrogen you develop, the more you're going to tap into more expensive electricity. And then that runs the risk of having more expensive hydrogen for everyone. So that really shows the point of not overdeveloping hydrogen in uses where you have alternatives that are cheaper.
Okay. Yeah. Of course, the ideal situation is you don't have that escalation with the electricity costs because you have your own renewable electricity system, or you have it different. But yeah, thanks. So Thomas, we've heard a few examples of tax and regimes and risks. What's your sense of what's happening out there and what the different mechanisms that are being looked at? Thanks.
Thank you. So I think, first of all, and we published something we call the policy dashboard last year that was looking over markets of what the level of maturity of hydrogen support policy looks like. And I think one of the conclusions was that to date, a lot of the focus has been on R&D support in terms of actual finances spent on the hydrogen technologies. But what we're, I think, really looking for is deployment support, which is a very different type of mechanisms required, and to some extent at a different scale. I think in general there are a lot of policies and financing structures that are emerging and not so many in place. There is a contract for difference discussion in Europe, which is not fully launched yet. There is discussions around production tax credits in the US. that are not yet launched. And I think obviously the industry is in some markets holding its breath and trying to figure out exactly what's coming and waiting with investments, and you get perverse incentives to hold back because projects are waiting for the incentive mechanisms to kick in. We can talk a little bit about what makes sense here, right? I think it's worth, in terms of policy, what we do see though is that proven mechanisms are being reused. So markets that have experience with a typical, with a mechanism, they're repurposing it from renewables to hydrogen. And I think that makes sense for a lot of reasons. The operators in the market and the investors are familiar with it, and often those mechanisms are adjusted to the tax system that you have in place in the market or other mechanisms that you can tap into. With that said, I think there is a real concern in the US, for example, that if you suddenly get $3 per kilogram of production tax credit for hydrogen, tax credit or tax appetite will actually run short in the market, and that will increase the price for funding instead of reducing it. I'll say one more thing, and there's been a lot of discussions about de-risking here, which I think is a very healthy conversation. First of all, I think the risk of these projects are, and these are by profile, high capital, low OpEx type of projects. And I think in those contexts, what we really want to de-risk is offtake, not necessarily cost, because when you're running an operation with very high EBITDA contributions, losing 10% of your sales compared to being able to reduce your cost by 10%, it's just a whole different impact on your returns. So finding a way of supporting the market that you can put your product into is equally or more important than securing a price point. And that goes to the second, I think, point on risk. We tend to think of two types of risk. One is market risk, which is really your exposure to alternatives. So you're competing with other forms of energy, and there is a price point for those alternatives, and in some markets there is a gap that you would need to close, either by customers paying extra or in other financial support mechanisms. That's generally a moving target. So, obviously right now we're in a very volatile situation, and fossil fuel prices are all over the map. And if you would have set fixed price subsidies in the last year, they would have been irrelevant in the current market, and you would basically have been providing significant subsidies to markets that wouldn't need subsidies, right? So there is a need to have some relative mechanisms, ideally for the market exposure. But there's also the first mover risk, which means that whoever invests in a project now will be uncompetitive with their peers in a few years when the cost of electrolyzers come down and new projects come in at a lower cost point. And that's a different profile of that risk because it's much more linked to the upfront cost, and you can address it more, in a more surgical way, if you like. And there are less moving parts in that risk exposure, and a upfront type of cost reduction, if you like, or subsidy would make more sense.
Thanks. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please don't be shy. Okay, one question here. Do we have a microphone, or do you want to yell and I'll repeat the question?
I'll probably just yell. Yeah.
If you've got kids who'd be good at yelling across the big room.
So, my name's James Webber. I'm an antitrust lawyer from Sherman Stern.
Can everyone hear James? Maybe stand up, James, please, or come and take the microphone. Oh, there's a mic. Here, come in. If you'd like, come and take a microphone, and because I think the people up the back of the room. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, I'm an antitrust lawyer and a European Union lawyer. And one of the things about public investment that we've not touched on yet is the interaction between different systems of public incentivization. And first sort of top of mind issue in that respect is the EU is giving itself the power to investigate subsidies that have been given by other governments. And this is on top of or in addition to the WTO powers that have existed for a long time in this respect. So if you've got a hydrogen project outside the EU that has been subsidised in some way, the EU is granting itself the ability to be able to investigate that subsidy and extract it back, right? If the EU judges that subsidy to not be in the EU's interests. In addition to that, the EU is also giving itself the ability to be able to massively loosen its own subsidisation rules so as to support hydrogen development within the European Union. And so if you put those two things together, you have the risk of potentially significant distortions to investment decisions for hydrogen projects where, you know, because of that subsidisation, those two halves of the subsidisation question, you may see hydrogen projects happen in Europe, right, which should have happened if the market worked properly where renewables were cheapest. Right? And so you've got steel, let's say, legacy steel in Europe being subsidised in this way and protected, and that's preventing steel from being produced in areas of the world that's got access to much, much lower cost renewable energy, which is, of course, the key thing for green steel. So in all of that introduction, I wondered whether anyone had given any thought to sort of this interaction between the subsidy, I suppose subsidy competition, really, between different parts of the world, and whether there's any insights into how companies or governments can kind of manage those risks.
It's a great question. And also, anyone from the audience, if you want to answer, please put your hand up. But John, I think you would like to respond first.
Well, the subsidy question gets quite complicated because, as I'm sure he knows, the Europeans have developed this whole subsidy law, and it's been quite controversial, particularly in Europe. There's another piece to it that the question didn't get into, but there's also a subsidy issue under WTO rules. So yeah, you have two areas of subsidies and how they operate. And it gets kind of complicated because everybody, well, not everybody, but many countries want to subsidize the production of green hydrogen. And so what is a discriminatory subsidy versus a non-discriminatory one? And why should it be left to the Europeans to decide what's a discriminatory subsidy around the world? And so it's kind of a complicated question. The U.S. has some temptation to do the same thing in slightly different fashion. But in any event, it really behooves us to get together to have a coordinated set of rules so we don't have one region or one country saying, there's a subsidy that we don't agree with, so we're going to reach out and tax that subsidy indirectly to get rid of it. And some other countries say, hey, that's not fair. And you know, who sets the rules right now? It's this OECD inclusive framework that's doing it. A lot of developing countries disagree with that. They feel the UN ought to be setting the rules. It's a more democratic institution, for want of a better term. So this area gets very, very intricate and convoluted, so to speak, but it's worthwhile being aware of the whole issue of subsidies, both from a European sense of subsidies and more broadly this trade area of WTO rules.
Yeah, fascinating. Tom?
That was an interesting one. I think it was in 2018. For some time, Namibia has been running what we call the export processing zones. Basically, what we're trying to do is to incentivize manufacturing production, and people were given tax break. And in 2018, the EU came and said, no, wait a minute, I think you are a tax haven and therefore we had to stop this. And then we were like, wait a minute, but we also know that you're subsidizing some of your industry. And then like, no, ours is not discriminatory and therefore yours is discriminatory. And again, it's again, who police what? And for us, for developing country, we always feel that, you know, the developed economies always think they got the right to tell others what to do, even to tell you not to do things not only what they did, but also sometimes what they are still doing. But somehow they want to make theirs look different. So this is really, I hope, that's why I'm saying, because of collaboration when it comes to this, and even when it comes to standards and everything else, the regime, the standards and everything else will be something that has been agreed by everybody, and therefore not having someone to come and say, no, that's what's wrong, because we in Europe want to do it this way. But coming back on the tax incentive, though, it's conceivable, really, to give a tax incentive, but hopefully also having a sunset clause. It does not become a perpetual subsidy, because then if that happens, then you may then also create a situation where you are going then to run unproductive, investment, but simply because of the tax break that is perpetual, then you think, it's working, but actually it's not working. But it's conceivable to say, you want something, to quickly, to reduce the cost, and therefore, for a while you want to do this, but there has to be a sunset clause to say only up to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess your luxury also is that you can sit back and look at the history and say, oh, you may be saying this, but actually we think that's wrong, or we don't agree with some of them. So you can always just make your own assessments and your own lessons learned. Thomas, did you want to respond to James's question?
Just a quick comment. I think it is a difficult question, because you're touching also on the adjacent political priorities that are affected by the subsidies, and I think sometimes I think our the view of subsidies and a quote unquote fair market, to this extent it actually exists, it's relevant in a stable market, and we're now not in a stable market, and we're not going to be in a stable market for quite some time. We usually say that there is no business as usual. The next 30 years will look nothing like the last 30 years. Whoever is banking their investments of a business environment that looks like the last 30 years are basing their investment on bad strategy. So that's going to be and I think there are examples of where other political priorities completely trump the lowest cost supply. I mean, obviously, technically, the lowest cost supply for energy in Europe would still be to buy Russian natural gas, but we're not doing that for a very important political reason. The reason for European Union to spend half of its budget on agricultural subsidies is not because it's the lowest cost supply chain for food. It's because of other political priorities. And that's always going to be the case. And if you want to pivot the conversation to the German government and talk to them about why it's important to have a steel industry in Germany, that's a very different topic. And I think that's a very high political priority, and they will find a way to protect the German steel industry independent of the subsidy structure for hydrogen, if they make that a political priority.
Yeah, and every sovereign nation has the right, of course, to protect its own interests. And what price carbon? Reducing carbon. Any more questions from the room or comments? Yep. No, I can tell, probably. Sorry, there's a microphone coming. Thank you. Oh, sorry, here, please. We'll do musical microphone.
Thanks. I'm Husiame Kweli from Sasol in South Africa. It's an integrated energy and chemicals business. I think I have mentioned it in the other panel, that fully entrenched in terms of the merits of green hydrogen and some of the projects that we are rolling out together with the government of South Africa in terms of transitioning. But for me, it's really to direct the question to the funders, to the financiers around the room, in terms of the form of financing. I think Mr. Blank raised it earlier, that a lot of what comes through in developing countries, it's not only incentives or funding on the capital build side, which is normal, or technology, but there is quite a lot of need in terms of, especially especially the hard-to-abate sectors where they are transitioning from where they are into getting into the green hydrogen space, is the deployment funding as well, in terms of how do you deploy and transition employment and all of that. We haven't even to date, and I think it speaks across all developing countries as well, is the terms that come through with the financing as you deploy it out for green hydrogen, the detail that comes into it. So just pretty much to hear, given the challenge that we're facing in developing and emerging markets of not only capital side, technology side, and the cost of green hydrogen, but the transition phase as well that requires to be funding. Are you having a view in terms of that funding mechanism or that angle, and how are you fashioning or channeling your funds to make sure that we emerge even from hard to abate sectors and to transition? And are you looking at those kind of forms of guarantee or financing and assistance?
Thank you. Great question. Ines, do you have any thoughts? You don't have to, but I just thought you haven't spoken for a while. Or is IDRI working on those kind of issues, looking at that?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I think the question was towards support strategies for emerging countries in particular. I haven't worked on the topic of emerging countries in particular, but I can tell you a few things still. So I said earlier that support policies aren't all of the story. I think it's very important when you talk about hard-to-abate sectors to also think about the mechanisms that are needed to start the demand in difficult sectors. It is not self-evident. It just doesn't just happen when you have hydrogen. And at the European level, we're discussing different types of mechanisms. I can tell you about contracts for difference. We're discussing having carbon contracts for difference in particular, where the government would pay the difference to producers between the carbon price set by the ETS and the price of the technology, so that it helps the technologies compete with fossil alternatives. So that's a mechanism. It requires quite a lot of funding, but it is an important mechanism. And several member states are advancing on this. It's already in place, I believe, in the Netherlands, but it's also being discussed in Germany and in France and other member states. And I can also tell you about quotas, which are not a financial, it's not a financial mechanism per se, but it helps de-risking because it gives a long-term perspective on demand per sector. I don't think a quota all across the board necessarily makes a lot of sense because hydrogen is not supposed to be all across the board. But having quotas on some sectors that are difficult, such as steel or aviation, it can be useful for some sectors, or also putting a quota on green procurement, for example, because in a lot of countries, public procurement is actually a lot of money. So starting there can be quite a good idea. So those are some ideas. I can tell you a lot, like for another hour, but I think I'll give the...
Maybe you can meet together. And I think also setting quotas, it's such a boost because it gives financing confidence. Is that what you're going to say, Thomas? It allows the investors to say, okay, now we've got something to hang our hat on. So it is, in a roundabout way, public support, causing finance. Thomas, did you want to add to that?
No, I think back to the question that offtake is equally important to cost in these markets. And I think we often also overlook the infrastructure. We talk about supply and demand, but in between you have infrastructure. And the challenge, one of the challenges is that all these pieces the Lego pieces are very different size when you try to build your house here. And that means that especially the piece in the middle will come with very volatile utilization. It's very hard to invest in infrastructure without experiencing very volatile utilization, I think. So another mechanism that is not direct funding but equally sort of helps de-risk the market would be regulation of infrastructure. And we're very familiar with regulated grids, power grids, and regulated natural gas grids. But I think both here in Germany and Europe and FERC in the US just recently went out and said that they're not going to regulate hydrogen pipelines, right? Which is putting the infrastructure investors in a difficult position.
If I can add to that, I think, the infrastructure point is a very important point because it's, of course, quite difficult. You can't do much with half an infrastructure. You do it or you don't. There's part of that with infrastructure. But it's also, infrastructure is something, it's investments that are very long-term, like I think natural gas pipelines stay for like 5 decades. So it's not just something you can do and then maybe if it's not useful, you stop using it. It's a very difficult topic, and I think the first issue we need to settle before deciding on infrastructure is end uses of hydrogen. Again, I'm repeating myself, but if you want to use hydrogen for all of your trucks, then you need refueling infrastructure kind of all along highways. If you only want hydrogen in the industry, you basically don't need infrastructure, you don't need much. So it is very important to decide what sectors you want to develop hydrogen in. And I think going into the infrastructure debate without having decided what you want to have hydrogen for is very risky. It's a bit slippery.
Yeah, and we've heard so often already today that we should be looking at demand as being the biggest criteria for ramping up hydrogen. I was just going to add also in that vein, you could say that creating capacity and training programs and training your youth, that's also a form of public financing because you're allowing the industry to succeed. Did you want to add something? Sorry.
I heard the question a little bit differently about who gets the subsidy, and the short answer to that is who gets what, when, and how, to be perfectly blunt about it. A lot of that is a political question, but I think the broader question was, if we're giving subsidies to industry, how about the users? How about the communities that are being impacted by the whole thing? And for what period does the subsidy apply? I mean, there's a risk element there. You're providing a subsidy far beyond the period when it makes any sense. Or maybe, contrarily, you're not providing for a long enough period of time. But the real question is, who does get the subsidy? How efficient is it, whoever you're giving it to, and for what period of time?
And I think we have 1 minute left of the session, although we did start a bit late. I think that wraps up things. I think perhaps many people came to the room thinking we were talking about dollars and mechanisms, but actually it's such a bigger discussion, and it's so, it can be so wide in what forms. It's not always in the form of transferring capital. May I ask, in reverse order, just your final words. What do you, in terms of public financing and what you see is happening, do you lose sleep over anything at night? What's your biggest concern that we do wrong or that we're not doing best? Not to be negative, but just what is your biggest area of warning or advice?
I think certainty for the near-term investment period is important in markets, so that at least the project coalitions that you often have to form across the supply chain at least know what policy environment and subsidy structure they can bake into their project financing.
Ines?
Yeah, I think I don't lose sleep over hydrogen at night. But I think, if in the room you're people that are discussing designing policies, I think my point about adaptiveness is very important. We're starting new. This is a very new sector. We have some uses of hydrogen, but when we're looking at 2050, it's about developing a lot of new uses, a lot of different supply routes, a lot of new infrastructure. It's a huge task, and I think saying, okay, we're trying this, and in 5 years' time, we'll look at how efficient it has been, and we'll adapt our support is, I think, a very important point.
Yeah. And Minister Alwinda, what is your biggest, I mean, you gave us a good overview of what is your biggest area of concern, I guess, or priority?
Yeah, let me just end by saying, I think certainly public funding, it's necessary. In Namibia, we just got 40 million euro from the German government actually to do some public funding. And that was mostly with R&D. It was mostly with training of the young people. We just gave scholarship to the young people actually to start to understand this. Is to develop the strategy, because again, the investors need to know within which environment they are going to make that investment, to develop the market. So those are the things which you need actually to use public fund to do that. And that for me, it will be the right de-risking strategy you should have to use public funds for. But again, as I said, you could also then find a way to just have public funds to invest, clearly just invest as an investment. But if you are going to give tax incentive, make sure that it does not become a lasting subsidy that may be difficult then for you to take it away, because once you give it, it's very difficult to take it away unless it was initially agreed to say it was going to be for a certain time period. But also I think as we go on with private sector funding itself, it's also evolving. In Namibia, we also got financial institutions that are actually issuing green bonds now actually to fund some of these projects. We have got our pension funds that are also actually starting to make money available to invest in the green hydrogen fund. So I think with the private sector funding also evolve, and therefore we may not have to have too much emphasis put on public funding. But certainly it has a role to play.
Thanks. And the final word, John.
I'm within this. I don't lose sleep over green hydrogen. I may lose sleep over my grandchildren or my black lab, but not green hydrogen. But maybe that's coming. Who knows? In any event, my last word would be, each country is a little bit unique. One solution doesn't fit every place. And so you have to take that into account in formulating your policy.
And my final comment is it's all about collaboration, working together, learning from each other, lessons learned, sharing ideas. And that's what IRENA aims to do, to support everyone in their endeavors. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you for being here. Please thank our panel. Thank you.